Do you think Kiev will become a Russian city in the near future?
Uh, I don't know. I mean, who knows? Kiev.
I mean,
Well, first of all,
historically, do the Russian people do they view Kiev as a Russian city historically?
well,
Because
yeah,
Kharkov and Odessa, I understand they view
it's
these as
almost
Russian
entirely
cities.
Russian speaking, and I think
Right.
Kiev is actually. I don't know if it's majority Russian speaking, but I think it may be. That there's an effort to change that, but the Ukrainians are finding it difficult. In fact, the leadership, what I hear is like when they have meetings, non-public meetings, they all speak in Russian. I think that that's actually still the mother tongue of most people in Kiev. It doesn't mean if you're Russian speaking that you identify as an ethnic Russian. Ukraine's a complicated place. Um, yeah, there's this big question: is there a chance? A lot of Ukrainians. There are these Banderites. Um, who again, have always been there, even through the Soviet years. We can go into that in more detail right now. I'm reading a very interesting history on that. They've always been there, and they have, since really taken power and come into their own, taken control of the military, and have a great deal of influence within the government, so that their thinking has become pretty much just sort of a modified version of it, of Banderism, slightly prettied up for Western consumption so that we don't openly talk about our, Jew hatred or something, or we set that aside because that's not so important. Um, the, it has become really the ruling ideology in so many ways. Again, I think that explains why they're still fighting, why they won't make the hard decisions that they need to make. But can that be reversed? That's kind of a hard question to answer. Could we have some sort of real meaningful counter coup within Ukraine? When people say this was a huge mistake, Banderism has destroyed this country. Let's throw these bums out. And at this point, you don't see any sign of it. Well, you see only indirectly in the fact that, like, for example, when the press gangs grab somebody on the street, a crowd will immediately form and try to rescue the guy. Or that happens again and again. It shows that there's a lot of anger at the regime among common people. Now, you can have a lot of anger, and a regime can still, against a regime, and that regime can go on and on and on. You have to have organized opposition. And a powerful opposition, something that has to extend into the corridors of power. It has to have arms. And right now, that's not happened. But maybe we could have some military coup, not carried out by the Banderites. Unfortunately, again, within the military, it's like the leaders, the ones that are most likely to lead a coup at the present time, if it should happen, are Banderites themselves. So you just don't see it. But maybe somewhere down the road, there will be some change. That's all I can say.
Well,
So anyway, we're talking about Kiev. That is a very large city. We're talking about a city of like over 3 million, I believe. It would be very hard to take. A good part of it is on the western side of the Dnieper, on the right bank, and I don't know if the Russians want to do. They may decide to do it. They may find as things develop that they sense that there's a shift occurring within Ukraine. The Ukrainians have become so weak, that what would be almost an impossible task. Maybe not impossible, but it would require general mobilization within Russia. It has become, a much more feasible task. So it could happen somewhere down the road. I don't think it's anywhere on the current agenda. I think they're probably much more focused, especially in light of these recent attacks on the tankers on southern Ukraine, which again historically has been a part of Russia. So, I'm speaking, mainly of Odessa and Nikolaev,
right.
that's something that would be strategically more important. But they may find, who knows, maybe they'll do that first and then find that Ukraine is really weakened not just militarily, but maybe ideologically. I don't know if that's going to happen. Maybe that those extremists will only become all the more extreme as the end draws near. It's hard to say.
Right. I mean, you're saying how, the up in Sumy, there's a clear shot to Kiev from there. And then if we talk about a proper collapse that we think is coming, when that happens, what does the regime do? It has to force conscript as many people as it can. What it can do, like what
Yeah.
try to
Right. At
force
some
people.
point, they're going to go out and look for guys, and there's not going to be anything.
There's
You
no,
know, they're-
or everybody will start turning on the regime. Just say, well, now we want the Russians here because it's over, and you refuse to admit that it's over and settle some deal, and you're just killing what few men remain. Maybe you're going to start sending women to the front. Who knows? At that point, then it's just like you have become the bad guys, and you become illegitimate, and then there will be a welcome change, and then people will want the Russians to come in to save them from this oppressive regime. Essentially, maybe that's what will happen. I don't know.
Yeah.
But-
No, that's worth considering. I mean, it just seems like,
But at the end of
again,
the-
in a way, I'm surprised it hasn't happened already. I mean, again, these people just have a real firm grip. They have a firm grip on military power, and then also on the information space to the extent that it's possible. In these days, it's not very hard for anyone, including in Ukraine, to go find a Telegram channel or whatever. I think maybe part of it is many of them been so brainwashed that they don't look at the Russian channels. I'm sure some of them do, but a lot of them have been told, they just lie. And they kind of think, I have the sense about a lot of Ukrainians, they see their own governments corrupt and lies all the time. They assume the Russians is just a mirror image of that. And so they don't even believe it. It's sort of like they don't understand that things have changed since the 1990s. Ukraine never got out of that, but Russia really did to a great extent. And they don't see it. So anyway, there's control over the military and over the information space, because you have this really, I would say, a diabolical alliance between the Banderites and the Western nationalists. And the Western nationalists really control the information space, and they're very tightly allied with the Europeans, and they get derive their authority from the Europeans. So, they say, this is the truth. This is what the Europeans say. And there are a lot of people who just still have this abiding faith in Europe, which I think is very much misplaced, but it's there.
Right. But I mean, at the end of the day, this war won't end until there is a regime change in Kiev. We can't have this Zelensky. I mean, first of all, Putin has said as well that this is an illegitimate leader. He didn't have elections. So an agreement that they have with him we can't recognize that. Right. So there's going to be a regime change, whether it's organic or if Russia forces it. That's what's going to happen. Right. And that means doing something in Kiev, right?
No, it's a good point. And it may be that the Russians will see the logic of that. They'll just decide, this is something we have to do to make this permanent. That's the problem. Because if we go so far and then stop, it's not over. They're just going to look for another day. And that regime is going to be there. They're going to be just devoted to our destruction, and they're going to have the support of the Europeans and probably the Americans with a future administration or something. They may go for Kiev. I think there is a real logic there. It's not West Ukraine. There's a real difference. When you get Eastern and Southern Ukraine, you get a large percentage of people that identify as Russians. Not just Russian speakers, but ethnic Russians. But then in Western Ukraine, that's the real, home of Banderism. And you do get these ideological zealots that, that's where they are, that's their home, and you go into that territory, you're going to be faced with a populace that actually just hates you, that has been trained to hate you, that, they've made that part of their identity. It's an anti-Russian identity that they have. That's not true for, I think, central Ukraine, which is Kiev is a part of. It's not ethnically Russian, but there are ethnic Russians there. But it has always been long been an in-between area. And that in-between area could maybe switch, maybe if the Russians still finally come and then, the populace that supported the previous regime said, well, they lost. Here's the new, the new regime, and let's see how it works. And if like Mariupol and whatever, or anything to any indication of what could happen, it's actually worked out very well. I mean, these are you don't hear anything about Mariupol, for example. There was a very a very destructive battle there, of course, in 2022. The Russians took it from the Ukrainians. A lot of the city was destroyed, but it's being rebuilt. And, life is increasingly is good there and better than it ever has been under the Ukrainian government.
Hmm. Do you think that there's any chance that we're not seeing more rapid movement currently on the front is because there is some semblance of a negotiation, of a peace settlement, that maybe Russia is trying to give Trump a little bit of space, and that's why there's not an operational bloom? Or do you think that that's not in their calculation at all? It's like, let's just move forward, because the faster they move, then the more leverage they have, right? That's like,
I don't think so. I think it's just that the Russians are being very cautious and trying to conserve their own lives. This, again, is still, because this is a drone war above all. When you come to the front lines, and even though there's been this tremendous loss of manpower, the Ukrainians still have drones, and they still can kill you if you try to mass your forces and attempt a big aero offensive. And so they still proceed very cautiously. At some point, I don't know where that tipping point is. I think that'll change. I think they're just being careful. Another thing that's going on is that there's this that we haven't even discussed. There's this war in the air, which is a completely one-sided war. It's just that Russia pummels Ukraine every night, and sometimes during the day as well. They've been just one huge strike after another, and they have taken their power grid, just, really have, wiped out most of it. We've talked about, why it took so long. It was actually built with overcapacity by the Soviets, and then there was this loss of population or whatever. So it was like 150% or 160%, but they've taken it down to like 20%. Actually, Ukrainians are forced to import electricity now from Europe, whereas before they used to export electricity to EU. But that still isn't enough. There are regularly scheduled blackouts all throughout the country. And I guess it's particularly bad in the eastern part of the country because the Russians haven't just taken out power plants and substations, but transmission lines. So they've taken it right to the edge. It's already it's crippled. It's on life support. And I think at any time, if they decide, they can just take it out completely. And they might do that before a big aero offensive, just to just completely freeze Ukrainian logistics. But that's going on, and then attacks on the rail system, on train stations, and on air bases and other military infrastructure. That's just happening all the time, and it is wearing down. So where they're not just being worn down at the front lines, they're being worn down in the rear too. And the thing is, the reason I bring it up right now is that, if anything, that has accelerated since the so-called negotiations have begun. So it's kind of interesting. Before, there was this hue and cry about it. It's like the Russians it's not fair. They're actually attacking from the air, and obviously they're not interested in peace. The Russians just ignored that and went ahead and continued to accelerate. And now we don't even hear much talk about it. Clearly the Russians are committed to this, regardless of what's happening in the diplomatic space, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, I saw a video on X of a steam train being used in Ukraine because apparently some of these trains, they're all require electricity to run, and I guess it was being too intermittent and they couldn't run, so they pulled out a steam engine. So this is just an example of, like, if you don't know the writing's on the wall, when you look at your country resorting to steam trains, you're like, I think we're in trouble. Yeah, it's over, right?
Yeah, no, I've heard that from different sources, and it may very well be true.
Yeah, I did see X.
I saw a community note on X that said this was like a Christmas train, a tourist thing, and so it might not be true, but it could be. The fact is that their train service has been severely impacted. Mm-hmm. But let's be not so sure about that one story, but it's just true. They're in a terrible fix, so it's not just that you don't have power, often it could be 16 hours a day. But also, just traveling from city to city is becoming increasingly difficult because, trains, you can't rely on trains to run anymore. They rely on the electrical grid just like everyone else does.
Right. So it's just, yeah, things are just looking so bleak. And let's talk a bit about Ukraine's only hope, its backers. Thomas Massie just put a bill to the floor to have the U.S. Leave NATO. Do you think this is a real possibility that that NATO will end, that the United States could actually leave? I think General Flynn has also expressed similar sentiments that, yeah, what's the point of NATO? This is a Cold War relic, and it's just costing us tons of money and doing nothing for us except causing problems.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. Well, again, it's. I hope it succeeds. I doubt that it will, but it's you have to start somewhere. There's still, my understanding, a very strong bipartisan consensus to support NATO. It's just like this status quoism is very powerful. We always had NATO. How can we give up on NATO? And I think it's going to be here for a while, but I hope one day, and maybe. Potentially a real severe defeat here in the Ukraine war will lead to some real soul searching in the West, and I think just a really hard headed analysis of NATO and the need for it, or maybe the absence of that need. I hope that we're there. We're not there yet, but it's good to see. It's just like you see it on Trump on good days, right? He's anti-NATO. He clearly doesn't like it. That's good. And then there are individuals like Thomas Massie and General Flynn. But in general, it's just like we still have the old establishment, and they just can't imagine NATO going away. It's going to be here for a while.